The August sun hammered down on the dusty roadhouse, like a fist against weathered wood. Through grimy windows, light sliced across sticky tables and worn linoleum. Marianne Carter balanced a tray of sweating beer bottles, her tank top already damp at 7:30 in the morning. The men at table 4 erupted in coarse laughter. One grabbed at her arm. His fingers caught fabric. Pulled. There it was. The tattoo. An F-22 squadron insignia. Dark against her shoulder. The laughter died instantly. The morning heat seemed to freeze solid. Marianne Carter had learned to make herself small in this forgotten corner of Iowa, though her body had never been built for invisibility. At 34 years old, she stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, with shoulders that remembered a different uniform, a different life entirely. Her hands, now rough from 3 years of carrying trays and washing glasses, had once gripped the stick of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. Her eyes, which she kept carefully downcast when serving customers who preferred their help subservient, had once tracked enemy aircraft through heads-up displays at twice the speed of sound. The dusty Spur Roadhouse sat 40 miles outside Cedar Rapids, in a town whose name appeared on no tourist maps and whose population had been hemorrhaging since the factories closed in the early 2000s. Here, in this pocket of America, where Confederate flags still flew from pickup trucks despite being 800 miles north of any Civil War battlefield, where the past was preferred to the present and change was viewed with violent suspicion, a black woman serving beer was already an aberration that the locals tolerated with thin patience. A black woman who spoke with what they called heirs proper grammar, clear diction. The absence of the submission they expected was an active provocation. The roadhouse opened at 6 every morning except Sunday, serving eggs cooked in yesterday's grease and beer to truckers passing through, construction crews heading to job sites, and men who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. The walls bore the patina of 40 years of cigarette smoke from before the ban, yellowed like old bones, and no amount of industrial-strength bleach could lift the smell from the warped floorboards. Flies circled lazily near the kitchen pass-through, and the jukebox in the corner played the same rotation of classic rock and country that it had been playing since the Clinton administration. Marianne had worked here for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days exactly. She knew, because she marked each shift in a small notebook she kept in her employee locker, not counting toward anything specific, not building toward some future goal, just marking time like a prisoner scratching lines on a cell wall, evidence that she had survived another day. Each mark represented 8 hours of swallowed words, of pride compressed into something diamond hard and hidden deep, of dignity maintained, despite everything designed to strip it away. The regulars had their names for her, each one carefully calculated to remind her of her place in their universe. College girl. Though she had never once mentioned her education, they could somehow smell it on her like a threat. City. Though she'd grown up in rural Alabama, in a town even smaller than this one. Princess, when they wanted to cut deeper, when her efficiency annoyed them, or her posture remained too straight, or she failed to laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She served their drinks with mechanical precision, cleared their plates before they could complain about the service, and kept her face as neutral as Switzerland while inside. In a place they couldn't touch, she performed complex calculations about medication costs and special education services and how many extra shifts she could physically survive. She had been 23 when she first saw an F-22 Raptor at an air show in Montgomery, Alabama. It was Armed Forces Day, and the sky was so blue it looked painted. The crowd had gathered early, families with children on shoulders, veterans in worn unit caps, teenagers trying to look unimpressed. But when the F-22 appeared, everyone fell silent. The aircraft didn't just fly through the sky, it owned it, commanded it, bent it to its will. Its thrust-vectoring nozzles pivoted with organic smoothness, making the impossible look effortless, turning physics into poetry. Marianne had stood at the fence line, fingers wrapped around the chain link until her knuckles went white. The Raptor climbed vertically, straight up like an arrow shot at heaven, its twin engines producing a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, vibrating through her chest cavity, rearranging something fundamental inside her. At the top of its climb, it seemed to pause, hanging motionless for an impossible moment, before pivoting on its axis and diving back toward Earth. The crowd gasped and cheered, but Marianne stood silent, transfixed. She felt something shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates realigning, as if she'd discovered a language she'd always known, but never heard spoken aloud. That night, she'd gone home to the apartment she shared with two roommates who worked at the same distribution center, a concrete box of a building where they loaded trucks from midnight to 8 in the morning. Her roommates were already asleep, preparing for another shift of mindless labor that paid just enough to survive, but never enough to escape. Marianne sat at the kitchen table with its wobbly leg and water-stained surface, and on a laptop held together with duct tape, she looked up the requirements to become an Air Force pilot. 4-year degree. She had that, aerospace engineering from Alabama A&M, earned on a full scholarship. While working nights at the distribution center, she'd graduated summa cum laude, though nobody had been there to see her walk across the stage. Her mother had been working a double shift at the hospital, where she cleaned floors, and Marcus had been having one of his difficult days where crowds and noise sent him into a spiral of anxiety. Physical requirements. She exceeded them all, her body strong from years of manual labor, from running 5 miles every morning before class because it was free and it cleared her mind, from denying herself everything that might slow her down. Vision 2020. Reflexes excellent. Aptitude unknown. But she had to try. The alternative was accepting the life everyone expected her to have: minimum wage. Maybe a supervisor position in 10 years, if she was lucky. Marriage to someone who'd peaked in high school, children she couldn't afford to give opportunities to. That was a death she couldn't bear. The recruitment office in Birmingham had been a converted storefront between a payday loan place and a beauty supply store, the kind of strip mall that dotted the South like acne scars. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Martinez, had kind eyes and the patient voice of someone who'd delivered bad news too many times. He'd looked at her transcripts, at her test scores that put her in the 99th percentile, at her athletic achievements from high school, when she'd run track because it was the only sport that didn't require expensive equipment. "Look," he'd said, leaning across the metal desk that separated them, his hands folded like he was about to pray. "I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying you should be realistic about your chances. Of the thousands who apply for pilot positions, only a few hundred are accepted each year. Of those, fewer than 10% are women. The number of black women flying combat aircraft in the entire Air Force?" He'd held up one hand, fingers spread. 5, maybe 6. And most of those fly transports or tankers, not fighters. "I've been doing this for 12 years. And I've never sent a black woman to fighter pilot training. Not one." "There's always a first time," Marianne had said. Martinez had studied her for a long moment, perhaps seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of his younger self, before dreams got ground down by reality. He'd sighed and pulled the application forms from a drawer. "Your funeral," he'd said. "Not unkindly. But if you're going to do this, you better be perfect. Not good, not excellent, perfect. They'll be looking for any reason to wash you out." Officer training school at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery had been 13 weeks of controlled suffering designed to transform civilians into officers. Marianne had arrived on a Tuesday in June, when the Alabama humidity was thick enough to swim through. The training instructor who met their bus had a voice like gravel and eyes that missed nothing. "Welcome to the beginning of your military career," he'd said, "or the end of your civilian delusions. We'll find out which soon enough." The first week had been about breaking them down, sleep deprivation, physical training that pushed bodies to failure, mental tasks performed under impossible stress. Marianne had watched candidates quit within days, walking away from dreams they'd held since childhood because the reality was harder than the fantasy. She'd survived by compartmentalizing, putting each moment of suffering in its own box, focusing only on the next task, the next minute, the next breath. Academics had been her sanctuary, while others struggled with navigation and meteorology, aerospace engineering and military history. Marianne absorbed it all with the desperate hunger of someone who knew knowledge was her only advantage. She'd study until lights out at 2200, then continue in the bathroom with a flashlight, memorizing regulations and procedures until the words blurred together. The physical training had been brutal but manageable. Years of manual labor had given her a strength that surprised the instructors. She could do push-ups until her arms shook, run until her legs went numb, carry equipment that made grown men stumble, but it was the obstacle courses that truly set her apart. The rope, climbs, and wall scales, and balance beams that required not just strength, but agility and fearlessness. She'd grown up climbing trees to escape her father's drunken rages, balancing on fence rails to avoid the dogs in neighbors' yards. This was just a refined version of survival skills she'd learned before she could read. When the psychological evaluations came back, Major Peterson, the chief psychologist, had called her in for a private meeting. His office had been deliberately calming, soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a small fountain gurgling in the corner. But his eyes had been sharp, evaluating. "Your stress tolerance scores are unprecedented," he'd said, holding her file like it contained something dangerous. "In 30 years of military psychology, I've never seen numbers like these. Your response to pressure, to adverse conditions, to potential failure, it's as if stress doesn't register with you the way it does with normal people." "Is that a problem, sir?" Marianne had asked. "No, it's a gift. But gifts like this usually come from somewhere. Have you experienced significant adversity in your past?" She'd thought about how to answer, how to explain that every day of being black in America was significant adversity, that every day of being poor was training in stress management, that every day of wanting more than you were supposed to want was practice in handling pressure. Her childhood had been one long stress test. An alcoholic father who disappeared when she was 12. A mother working 3 jobs to keep them housed, having responsibility for Marcus falling on her shoulders before she was old enough to drive. She'd learned to stay calm when the electricity was cut off, when there was no food in the refrigerator, when Marcus had meltdowns that lasted hours, and she was the only one who could reach him through the chaos in his mind. "Yes, sir," she'd said simply. "I have." Peterson had made a note in her file, and she'd seen him write exceptional candidate in the margins. Undergraduate pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi, had been where dreams went to die. The washout rate was 60%, and the instructors seemed proud of it. "Look to your left," the commanding officer had said on their first day. "Look to your right. One of those people won't be here in 3 months. Maybe both. Maybe you." The T-6 Texan II trainers were unforgiving machines that punished the slightest error. The first time Marianne had climbed into the cockpit, she'd felt simultaneously at home and terrified. The instruments had made sense. Intellectually, she understood the physics, the mathematics, the engineering. But translating that knowledge into action, while pulling 4 Gs, while her vision tunneled and her body weight quadrupled, while making decisions in fractions of seconds, that was something else entirely. Her first flight had been a disaster. She'd over-controlled the aircraft, chasing the instruments, fighting the plane instead of flying it. Her instructor, Captain Thompson, had been brutally honest in the debrief. "You're thinking too much," he'd said. "You're trying to engineer your way through the sky. The plane doesn't care about your degree. Feel it. Listen to it. Stop fighting and start flying." That night, she'd sat in her quarters and cried for the first time since arriving. Not from sadness, but from frustration. From the fear that maybe everyone had been right. That maybe this was beyond her reach. But the next morning, she'd gotten back in the cockpit, and something had clicked. Instead of thinking about angle of attack and lift vectors, she'd felt the aircraft's response through the stick, through the seat, through subtle changes in engine tone. The T-6 had stopped being a machine and had become an extension of her will. Within weeks, she was out flying students who'd grown up around aircraft, whose fathers were pilots, who'd been preparing for this their entire lives. Her landings became textbook examples. Her navigation was precise to the meter. Her formation flying was so smooth that her wingmen forgot they were in formation at all. Captain Thompson had stopped criticizing and started taking notes. When she'd moved to the 38 Talon, the supersonic trainer that separated fighter pilots from everyone else, she'd found her true calling. The 38 was demanding and unforgiving, a razor blade with wings that killed the incompetent and the unlucky with equal enthusiasm. But to Marianne, it was freedom incarnate. The first time she'd broken the sound barrier, feeling the slight bump as the aircraft pushed through that invisible wall, she'd laughed out loud in the cockpit, pure joy that the oxygen mask couldn't muffle. The 38 spoke to her in a language of vibration and response that she understood instinctively. She could feel energy state through the stick, know her airspeed by the sound of the slipstream, sense her angle of attack through subtle changes in the controls. While other students struggled with energy management, bleeding speed in turns and running out of options, Marianne danced through the sky, trading altitude for airspeed, potential energy for kinetic, always keeping enough in reserve for one more move. The dogfighting training had been where she'd truly distinguished herself. Air-to-air combat was chess at 500 miles per hour, requiring not just reflexes but anticipation, not just aggression but patience. She'd learned to think 3 moves ahead, to bait opponents into mistakes, to use their aggression against them. Her small size, which the male students had seen as a disadvantage, became an asset. She could handle more Gs for longer, her body requiring less blood to maintain consciousness. During one memorable engagement, she'd been paired against Lieutenant Colonel Razor Reynolds, an instructor with combat experience and a reputation for humiliating students. He'd come at her aggressively, using his experience to force her defensive, trying to intimidate her into a mistake. But Marianne had remembered something from Marcus's favorite nature documentaries. Sometimes the best defense was to become unpredictable. She'd suddenly reversed, pulling 9 Gs in a move that grayed her vision to pinpoints, using the 38's excellent thrust-to-weight ratio to go vertical when Reynolds expected horizontal. When he'd tried to follow, she'd unloaded and reversed again, ending up on his 6 o'clock before he'd even realized what had happened. Fox 2, she'd called calmly over the radio, indicating a simulated missile kill. In the debrief, Reynolds had looked at her with something between respect and amazement. "In 15 years of flying fighters," he'd said, "I've never seen a student pull that off. Where the hell did that come from?" "Desperation, sir," she'd answered honestly, "and maybe a little inspiration from Animal Planet." The room had erupted in laughter, but Reynolds had nodded approvingly. "Whatever works. That's the kind of thinking that keeps you alive in combat." The letter assigning her to F-22 training had arrived on a Tuesday in March. She'd been in the base gym at 05:30, running on the treadmill because a late winter storm had made outdoor running treacherous. The duty officer had found her there, handed her the envelope with unusual formality. She'd known immediately what it was. The paper was too heavy to be routine correspondence. The envelope bearing the seal of Air Combat Command. She'd opened it slowly, afraid that reading it too quickly might change the contents. "First Lieutenant Marianne Carter is hereby ordered to report to Luke Air Force Base, Arizona, for F-22 Raptor Basic Qualification Training." The words had blurred as tears came. Not tears of sadness, but of validation so complete it felt like breaking. The F-22 Raptor, the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, the absolute pinnacle of American air power. Fewer than 200 pilots in the entire world were qualified to fly it. She'd called her mother from the gym parking lot, not caring that it was still before 6 in the morning. "Mama, I made it. F-22 training. I'm going to fly the Raptor." Her mother's voice had been thick with sleep, but immediately alert. "Baby, I don't understand all these airplane names, but I can hear in your voice. This is big. It's the biggest, Mama. It's everything." Then you go show them. You show them what Marianne Carter can do. Luke Air Force Base in Arizona was where the atmosphere thinned and the standards rose to impossible heights. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, red and hostile, baked under a sun that seemed to take personal offense at human presence. The temperature on the flight line regularly exceeded 115 degrees, hot enough to blister exposed skin, to make the aircraft shimmer like mirages. The first time Marianne saw the F-22s lined up on the ramp, she'd stopped walking, transfixed, despite the heat radiating through her flight boots. They looked like predators at rest, angular, lethal, impossibly advanced. The Raptor's design was all angles and edges, stealth shaping that made it nearly invisible to radar, but gave it an aggressive, almost alien appearance. These were machines designed for one purpose: absolute air dominance. Her training class consisted of 24 pilots, all of them exceptional. All of them the best from their previous squadrons. Marianne was the only woman and the only black pilot. The others were polite but distant, watching her with the kind of careful evaluation reserved for an unknown quantity. She'd heard the whispers in the officers' club, the speculation about quotas and diversity initiatives, the bets on how long she'd last. The academics were crushing systems knowledge, that went beyond anything she'd previously encountered. The F-22's avionics were so advanced that much of it remained classified even from the pilots who flew it. They had to learn not just how to fly the aircraft, but how to manage its sensors, its data fusion, its weapons systems, its electronic warfare capabilities. The aircraft could track hundreds of targets simultaneously, identify and prioritize threats, suggest tactical solutions, even take control if the pilot became incapacitated. It was like learning to partner with an artificial intelligence that thought faster than any human could. The physical demands were even worse. The F-22 could pull 9 Gs sustained, and pilots had to be able to maintain consciousness and mental clarity while their bodies were crushed by 9 times normal gravity. The centrifuge training had been particularly brutal, sitting in a spinning capsule that replicated G-forces, practicing anti-G straining maneuvers until their faces distorted and their vision went black at the edges. Marianne had watched strong men pass out, wake up confused, and quietly remove themselves from the program. But she'd survived it all, using techniques she'd developed over years of handling impossible pressure. She'd compartmentalized each challenge, facing them one at a time rather than being overwhelmed by the totality. She'd studied until her eyes burned, practiced procedures until her hands moved without conscious thought, pushed her body until it adapted to stresses it was never designed to handle. The first time she'd actually sat in an F-22 cockpit had been almost religious in its intensity. The seat had felt custom-made for her body. The stick had fit her hand perfectly. The heads-up display had projected information directly onto the canopy, creating an augmented reality that made her feel like she could see through the aircraft itself. When the crew chief had helped her strap in 7 different attachment points to keep her secured during violent maneuvers, she'd felt like a knight being armored for battle. The twin Pratt and Whitney F-119 engines had come alive with a sound that was felt as much as heard, 35,000 pounds of thrust waiting to be unleashed. The aircraft had trembled with barely contained power, like a thoroughbred at the starting gate. When she'd released the brakes and advanced the throttles, the acceleration had been instant and overwhelming, pressing her back into the seat with a force that made her grin despite the pressure. Takeoff in the F-22 wasn't like other aircraft. It was like being shot from a cannon. The runway markers blurred past, the nose came up, and suddenly, she was climbing at an angle that would have stalled any other fighter. But the Raptor's thrust-to-weight ratio was greater than 1:1, meaning it could accelerate while climbing straight up, defying gravity with contemptuous ease. At altitude, the F-22 had revealed its true nature. It supercruised flew faster than sound without afterburner, as easily as other planes flew subsonic. The controls were so responsive that thinking about a maneuver seemed to make it happen. The fly-by-wire system translated her intentions into actions with no perceptible delay, making the 44,000-pound aircraft feel as agile as a sports car. But it was in simulated combat that the Raptor truly came alive. The aircraft's sensors could detect and track enemy aircraft beyond visual range, far before they even knew the F-22 was there. Its stealth made it virtually invisible to enemy radar. Its maneuverability at high angles of attack, the ability to point its nose independent of its direction of travel, gave it advantages in close combat that seemed to violate the laws of physics. During one training mission, Marianne had been tasked with intercepting 4 F-16 aggressors in a force-on-force exercise. The F-16s were flown by experienced instructors playing the role of enemy fighters, using their numbers advantage and coordinated tactics. The exercise was designed to be difficult, to push the F-22 and its pilot to their limits. Marianne had seen them first on her sensors, 4 contacts 40 miles out, flying in a combat spread formation. They hadn't seen her. The Raptor's stealth coding and design made it appear no larger than a marble on radar. She'd positioned herself up-sun, using every advantage, thinking through the engagement before the first shot. At 20 miles, she'd locked onto 2 targets simultaneously, one of the F-22's capabilities that still seemed like magic. The AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles had leaped from the internal weapons bay, the doors opening and closing in less than a second to maintain stealth. Fox 3, she'd called, indicating missile launches. Before the first missiles had even reached their targets, she'd already repositioned, using the Raptor's supercruise to cover distance without revealing her position through afterburner heat signature. The F-16s had reacted to the missile launches, going defensive, trying to locate their attacker. But Marianne was already setting up for the next engagement, using the Raptor's sensors to maintain awareness of all 4 aircraft simultaneously. The simulated engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes. 4 F-16s destroyed, without ever getting a clear picture of their attacker. In the debrief, one of the aggressor pilots had shaken his head in amazement. "It's not even fair," he'd said. "It's like bringing a gun to a knife fight." No, it's like bringing a rifle to a knife fight when your opponent doesn't even know you're there. But not every training evolution had gone smoothly. During a night formation flight, Marianne had experienced a flight control malfunction that had sent the aircraft into an uncommanded roll. For a terrifying moment, the Raptor had been out of control, its fly-by-wire system confused and conflicting. Her training had taken over. She'd immediately gone to backup flight control mode, fighting the aircraft back to level flight while running through emergency procedures from memory. The landing had been rough but successful, saving an aircraft worth $200 million. The investigation had revealed a software glitch, a one-in-a-million occurrence that had never been seen before. But Marianne's response had been textbook, her ability to maintain composure and work the problem rather than panic earning praise from the safety board. Outstanding airmanship, the report had concluded. Lieutenant Carter's actions prevented the loss of aircraft and demonstrated exceptional skill under extreme pressure, but it had been the human challenges that proved most difficult. Despite her performance, despite consistently scoring at the top of her class, the whispers persisted. After she'd beaten Captain Jake Stryker Morrison in a dogfighting competition, Morrison, who'd been flying fighters for 8 years and had combat experience over Syria, the rumors had started that she'd been given advantages, that the exercise had been rigged to make the Air Force look progressive. No way she beat Stryker straight up. She'd overheard in the officers' club. Political correctness is going to get people killed in real combat. Marianne had wanted to confront them, to point out that the engagement had been recorded, that every move was documented and could be analyzed. But she'd learned that defending herself only made things worse, gave them more ammunition. Instead, she'd focused on being undeniable, on performing at a level that made argument impossible. Her instructor during this period had been Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hammer Thompson, a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom with 2 confirmed air-to-air kills. He was demanding to the point of cruelty, finding fault with performances that would have been praised from other students. But Marianne had understood he was preparing her for a world that would demand perfection because she'd never get the benefit of the doubt. "You have to be twice as good to get half the credit," he told her after one particularly brutal debrief. "That's not fair, but it's reality. So be 3 times as good and make them choke on their doubts." She'd taken his words to heart, pushing herself beyond what was healthy or sustainable. She'd fly the simulator after duty hours, practicing emergency procedures until her hands moved without conscious thought. She'd study threat systems and tactics from potential adversaries, memorizing capabilities and weaknesses of aircraft she might face in combat. She'd work out twice a day, ensuring her body could handle the physical demands without hesitation. The solo flight that would earn her the tattoo had been scheduled for November 15, 2016. The weather briefing had called for clear skies and calm winds, perfect conditions for the evaluation that would determine whether she'd earned her place in the F-22 community. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson would be evaluating from the ground, monitoring every parameter, judging every decision. The night before, Marianne hadn't slept. She'd lain in her quarters, running through procedures, visualizing the flight profile, imagining contingencies and responses. She'd thought about everyone who'd said she couldn't do this, the recruiter who'd called it your funeral, the classmates who'd whispered about quotas, the instructors who'd been surprised when she'd excelled. She'd thought about her mother, working night shifts to keep them fed, never complaining, never stopping. She'd thought about Marcus, brilliant in his own way, but trapped in a mind that processed the world differently, depending on her to bridge the gap between his reality and everyone else's. At 0500, she'd been in the squadron, reviewing weather data and notices to airmen. The maintenance chief had briefed her on the aircraft's status tail number 04-195, nicknamed Valkyrie by the crew chiefs who spent more time with her than the pilots did. Everything was perfect, all systems operational, the aircraft eager to fly. The pre-flight inspection had been meticulous. Marianne had run her hands along the aircraft's skin, feeling for abnormalities that eyes might miss. She'd checked every panel, every door, every surface. The Raptor's stealth coating was delicate. Even a small ding could compromise its radar signature. She'd climbed into the cockpit with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. The startup sequence was a dance of switches and confirmations, bringing the aircraft's systems online one by one. The engines had spooled up with their characteristic whine, settling into a powerful idle. The flight control system had run through its checks, moving control surfaces in a complex pattern that looked like the aircraft was stretching before exercise. Raptor 2-1. Taxi to runway 21 right, winds 210 at 12, cleared for takeoff, the tower controller had said. Raptor 2-1. Cleared for takeoff runway 21 right. Marianne had responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She'd lined up on the runway centerline, looking down 3,000 meters of concrete that led to the rest of her life. The throttles had gone forward smoothly, the engines responding instantly. The acceleration had pressed her back into the seat, G-forces building even before she'd left the ground. At 120 knots, she'd eased back on the stick, and the Raptor had leaped into the sky like it had been waiting for permission to leave Earth behind. The flight profile had been comprehensive, testing every aspect of pilot and aircraft capability. Supersonic intercepts against simulated targets, requiring precise navigation and weapons employment. Basic fighter maneuvers that pushed the aircraft to its limits, pulling 9 Gs repeatedly, testing her ability to maintain consciousness and decision-making under extreme physical stress. Tactical scenarios that required managing multiple threats simultaneously, using the Raptor's sensors and weapons to dominate the battle space. At 40,000 feet, she'd executed a series of advanced maneuvers that would have been impossible in any other aircraft. The culbit, a tight loop with a snap roll at the top. The aircraft tumbling through the air in controlled chaos, before recovering to level flight. The Herbst maneuver, a rapid deceleration and pitch-up that made the aircraft swap ends, reversing direction in less space than seemed possible. These weren't just airshow tricks in combat. Such capabilities could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The weapons employment had been perfect. Every simulated missile launch within parameters, every gun pass precise. She'd managed her fuel carefully, always keeping enough reserve for contingencies, while still aggressive enough to accomplish the mission. She'd demonstrated mastery not just of flying, but of the entire weapons system, becoming one with the machine in a way that transcended mere proficiency. But it had been during the high angle of attack demonstration that she'd truly distinguished herself. The F-22 could fly at angles that would cause other fighters to depart controlled flight, using its thrust vectoring and fly-by-wire system to maintain control when physics said it should be falling from the sky. Marianne had pushed the aircraft to 70 degrees angle of attack, the nose pointing almost vertical while still maintaining forward flight. Then she'd executed a pedal turn using rudder to pivot the aircraft around its vertical axis while maintaining the extreme nose-high attitude, pointing the nose at will while the aircraft continued on its original trajectory. It was like ballet at 30,000 feet. A demonstration of control so absolute that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, watching from the ground, had actually stood up from his console. The maneuver required not just technical skill but an intuitive understanding of energy management, a feel for the aircraft that couldn't be taught. The margin for error was essentially 0 to aggressive, and the aircraft would depart controlled flight, potentially entering an unrecoverable spin. Too conservative, and the maneuver would fail, showing incomplete mastery. Marianne had held it perfectly, the Raptor pivoting in the sky like it was mounted on a gimbal, before recovering to normal flight with a smooth application of power and forward stick. She'd heard her own breathing in the oxygen mask, rapid but controlled, the exertion of fighting G-forces and managing the aircraft leaving her sweat-soaked despite the cockpit's climate control. The landing had been the final test. After 4 hours of intense flying, with her body exhausted from repeated G-forces and her mind saturated with information, she'd had to bring the $200 million aircraft back to Earth safely. The approach had been stable. On speed. On glide path. The touchdown had been so smooth that the crew chief later said he'd had to check the tires to confirm the aircraft had actually landed. As she'd taxied back to parking, the radio had crackled. Raptor 2-1. Outstanding performance. Welcome to the community. That was all Thompson had said over the radio, maintaining professional demeanor. But when she'd shut down the engines and opened the canopy, he'd been waiting at the foot of the ladder. As she'd climbed down on legs, shaking from exertion and adrenaline, he'd extended his hand. "Best stick and rudder I've ever seen," he'd said. And from him, those 7 words were worth more than any medal. The tradition was sacred in the fighter community. Every pilot who earned their place received the squadron tattoo, applied by a specific artist who'd been doing it for 20 years. That evening, the entire squadron had gathered in the back room of the tattoo parlor in Phoenix, a place that looked sketchy from the outside but was cleaner than most operating rooms inside. As the needle had worked the ink into her skin, Marianne had felt the weight of history. She was the first black woman to earn this mark, to be acknowledged as not just capable but exceptional in the most elite fighter program in the world. The other pilots had watched in silence, and she'd seen something shift in their expressions. Not friendship that would take more time, but respect, acknowledgement that she'd earned her place the same as they had. 3 months later, everything changed. The call had come during a night alert. While she was sitting in the ready room in full flight gear, waiting for a scramble order that would send them into the darkness to intercept unknown aircraft approaching American airspace. It was February, and even in Arizona, the desert was cold at night. She'd been reviewing threat profiles on her tablet when her squadron commander had appeared in the doorway. "Lieutenant Carter, you have an emergency call from Birmingham. You can take it in my office." The walk to the commander's office had seemed endless, her mind racing through possibilities, all of them bad. Emergency calls didn't come for good news. The phone had been waiting on the desk. The red light, blinking like a warning. "Marianne," her aunt's voice, which meant something had happened to her mother or Marcus. "I'm here. What's wrong?" "It's your mama, baby. Her kidneys. They've shut down completely. She's in the ICU at UAB Hospital. The doctors. They say you should come." The world had narrowed to a single point of focus. "Is she conscious?" "In and out. She's been asking for you. And Marcus. He doesn't understand what's happening. He's been here since yesterday. Won't leave. Won't eat. He keeps asking when you're coming. I'll be there as soon as I can get a flight." The squadron commander had already been working on emergency leave paperwork when she'd emerged from his office. The Air Force took care of its own in crisis, and within 4 hours she'd been on a commercial flight to Birmingham, still in her flight suit because there hadn't been time to change. The hospital had been exactly as she'd remembered from childhood, the same antiseptic smell, the same fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick, the same waiting rooms filled with desperate hope and crushing despair. She'd found Marcus in a corner of the ICU waiting room, rocking slightly, his hands flapping in the way they did when he was overwhelmed. He was 16, but in moments like this, seemed much younger, unable to process the chaos around him. "Marcus, it's me. It's Marianne." He'd looked up, and the relief in his eyes had been heartbreaking. "They won't let me see Mama. They keep using words I don't understand. The machines are so loud. When can we go home?" "Soon, buddy. Let me talk to the doctors first." Her mother had been barely recognizable beneath the tubes and wires. Dialysis machines, ventilator support, monitors tracking every vital sign. The doctor, a young resident who looked like he hadn't slept in days, had explained the situation in medical terms that Marianne translated automatically complete renal failure, likely caused by years of untreated diabetes and hypertension, damage too extensive to reverse. She needs dialysis 3 times a week minimum, probably for the rest of her life. There's a possibility of a transplant down the line, but the wait list is years long, and her other health conditions make her a poor candidate. "What about home care?" "That's possible once she's stable, but someone would need to be with her full time, and your brother." He'd trailed off. But Marianne had understood. Marcus couldn't care for himself, much less their mother. The staff had already called Adult Protective Services about him being at the hospital alone for over 24 hours. If Marianne hadn't arrived when she did, he might have been placed in state care. The Air Force had given her 2 weeks of emergency leave, then extensions as the situation had become clearer. But the F-22 program didn't pause for personal crises. Pilots had to maintain currency, had to fly regularly, or lose their qualification. After a month away, Marianne had received the call she'd been dreading. Colonel Sarah Williams, the wing commander, had been as kind as military protocol allowed. I've tried everything, Lieutenant. I've called in every favor. But Air Combat Command is clear. F-22 pilots must be available for immediate worldwide deployment. We can't hold your slot indefinitely. I understand, Mom. Do you? You're throwing away something extraordinary. You're the first, Marianne. The first black woman to fly the Raptor. Do you understand what that means? Not just for you, but for every young girl who sees someone who looks like her doing the impossible? My family needs me more than the Air Force needs symbols, ma'am. And after? When this stabilizes? You know you can't come back to fighters. The technology moves too fast. Once you leave, that door closes forever. I understand, ma'am. But understanding and accepting were different things. The discharge paperwork had been processed with military efficiency. Honorable discharge, exemplary service record, letters of recommendation that praised her skills and potential. But none of that changed the reality she was walking away from her dream to handle a nightmare. She'd moved her mother and Marcus to Iowa, where the cost of living was lower and the university hospital had an excellent renal program. The apartment was small but clean, government-subsidized housing that accepted her mother's disability payments. Marianne had needed immediate work, something that paid cash, and didn't ask too many questions about why someone with her qualifications was applying. The Dusty Spur had hired her on the spot. Dale, the manager, hadn't even looked at her application beyond confirming she was over 21 and could work mornings. The uniform had been polyester that reeked of cigarette smoke and resignation. The training had been minimal carry drinks, take orders, clean tables, don't talk back to customers no matter what they say. 3 years had passed in a blur of routine survival. Marianne would wake at 4:30 to help her mother with morning medications and set up for home dialysis. 5:30 arrival at the Roadhouse for opening prep. 6 to 2 serving customers who saw her as furniture that occasionally annoyed them. 2:30 pick up Marcus from his day program, where he was learning job skills that might one day allow him to stock shelves or bag groceries. 3 to 6 helping with homework, making dinner, managing medications. 7 to 9 at the dialysis center 3 days a week, reading year-old magazines while machines did what her mother's kidneys couldn't. 10 o'clock collapse into bed, setting 3 alarms because oversleeping meant cascading failure of the carefully balanced system. Weekends were for laundry and grocery shopping with coupons clipped from newspapers, for fighting with insurance companies over coverage, for taking Marcus to therapy, where he was learning to navigate a world that seemed designed to exclude him. There was no time for thinking about what had been lost, no energy for grief over abandoned dreams. Survival took everything she had. The money was never enough. $6 an hour plus tips that rarely materialized because the kind of men who drank beer at 7 in the morning weren't generous tippers. Her mother's disability payments covered rent and utilities most months. Marcus's program was subsidized but still required copays. Medications, even with insurance, ate hundreds of dollars monthly. The car, a 2003 Honda Civic with 200,000 miles, needed constant repairs that she couldn't afford to skip because without transportation, the entire system collapsed. She'd sold everything of value from her military service. The dress uniforms went to a surplus store for $200. The watch she'd bought to celebrate earning her wings, a small luxury that had felt like claiming something for herself, pawned for $300. Her flight jackets, patches, even her deployment bags, all converted to cash that disappeared into the endless maw of medical expenses. The customers at the Roadhouse had no idea who she was, what she'd been, what she'd given up. To them, she was just another black woman in service, existing to fill their drinks and clean their messes. They called her girl though she was 34. They made comments about her body, testing boundaries, seeing how much they could get away with. They left messes deliberately, small cruelties to remind her of her place. Roy Brennan was among the worst, though his cruelty was more casual than deliberate. He simply didn't see her as human, as someone with an interior life, or history, or dreams. She was a function, like a coffee machine or a television, something that existed for his convenience. The morning he'd grabbed her arm had been just another small violation in an endless series. A reminder that her body, her space, her dignity were provisional, subject to withdrawal at any moment. The revelation of the tattoo had shattered that careful invisibility she'd maintained for 3 years. Suddenly she was visible. Not as a person, but as an impossibility. A paradox that challenged everything these men believed about the world's proper order. "That's F-22 squadron insignia," the old veteran had said again, his voice carrying across the silent restaurant. 94th Fighter Squadron. Only pilots and crew chiefs get that tattoo, and you can't fake it. The artist won't ink anyone, not on the official list. Roy's face had gone through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, fear, like a slot machine cycling through options before landing on rage. "No way. No fucking way. You're telling me she flew fighters?" Her? The pronoun carried all the weight of his worldview. The impossibility that someone he'd classified as beneath notice could have soared above him in ways he couldn't even comprehend. His construction crew buddies had backed away slightly, sensing the energy shift, the danger that came when someone's reality was forcibly rewritten. "I'm not telling you anything," Marianne had said, keeping her voice level despite the tremor in her hands. "Your eggs will be right out." But Roy had stood, his bulk blocking her path to the kitchen. "No, you don't get to walk away. You explain this. You explain how someone like you has that tattoo." "Someone like me?" She'd let the question hang, forcing him to articulate what he meant. "You know what I mean." "I really don't." "Please be specific." The trap was obvious but unavoidable. Any answer would reveal the prejudice beneath his anger. He chose silence, but his face had grown redder, the veins in his neck standing out like cables. The woman with the laptop had been typing throughout the confrontation, and now she spoke again. "There's more here. Lieutenant Marianne Carter, call sign Valkyrie, graduated top of her F-22 qualification class. First black woman to fly the Raptor. Says here, she had the highest air-to-air combat scores in training history." There's a quote from a General Williams. "Lieutenant Carter represents the future of American air power. Her skills are matched only by her dedication to service." Each word had been another nail in the coffin of Roy's assumptions. The other customers were all looking now, some with phones out, finding the same articles, the same confirmation that their morning had taken a turn toward the surreal. "Why?" Roy's question had come out almost as a wounded sound. "If all this is true, why are you here? Why are you serving beer to people like to us?" For a moment, Marianne had considered telling him everything. About her mother's kidneys failing, about Marcus needing constant care, about the cruel mathematics of choosing between dreams and family. But she'd realized he wouldn't understand, couldn't understand. His world was too small for such complexities. "Because I chose to be," she'd said simply. "Bullshit. Nobody chooses this. Nobody with those kinds of options chooses this life." "Then maybe you don't understand what choice means." Dale had finally emerged from his office, drawn by the unusual silence. "Bad for business when customers stop drinking to stare." "Is there a problem here?" "Your waitress is lying to customers," Roy had said immediately, grasping for familiar ground. "Making up stories about military service. That's stolen valor. That's a crime." "She's not lying," the veteran had said firmly. "My grandson is ground crew at Luke. I just sent him her photo. He confirms she was there. Flew with the 94th. Says she was legendary. Says maintenance crews would compete to work on her aircraft because she treated them with respect, learned all their names, brought them food after long shifts." This detail, more than any other, had seemed to break something in the room's atmosphere. The idea that someone who'd flown $200 million fighters, had brought sandwiches to mechanics, had treated enlisted personnel as equals, didn't fit with anyone's preconceptions about either fighter pilots or black women. Eduardo had stepped out of the kitchen, his presence adding weight to Marianne's side of the invisible line being drawn. Sharon and Linda had moved closer too, their usual indifference replaced by something like protectiveness. Even customers she'd never exchanged more than order confirmations with began to stand, their body language making clear where their sympathies lay. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Dale had said, finding courage in numbers. "Pay your tab and go." Roy had looked around, seeing no support, only faces that reflected his shame back at him. His crew was already moving toward the door, abandoning him to his humiliation. He'd thrown a 20 on the table with unnecessary force. "Keep the change. Buy yourself something nice." The insult had been weak, desperate, the last shot of someone who'd already lost. After they'd left, the restaurant had remained silent for a long moment, everyone processing what they'd witnessed. The veteran had approached first. "I need to apologize," he'd said quietly. "I've been coming here 3 years, same as you've been working here. Never once asked your name. Never saw you as anything more than the girl who brought my coffee. I was wrong." "It's Marianne," she'd said. "Tom Bradley. Flew Hughes in Vietnam, 68th Assault Helicopter Company. Nothing like what you did, but I know what it means to fly, what it means to serve, what it means to give it up." Others had approached then, tentative but sincere. The woman with the laptop had introduced herself as Jennifer Chen, a journalist working on a story about rural America that had just become something entirely different. Dale had mumbled something about not knowing, about maybe they could work something out with scheduling, about flexibility for her mother's appointments, but Marianne had felt no triumph. The clock had read 8:45. Her mother's dialysis was at noon. Marcus needed pickup at 3. The car needed gas. $18. Until Friday. The brief eruption of her past into the present hadn't changed these material facts. During her break, she'd sat in her car and called her mother, the routine check-in that anchored her days. "How are you feeling, Mama?" "Oh, you know. Still here. Still fighting." "Did you eat breakfast?" "Yes, ma'am." A lie, but a familiar one. "Anyone give you trouble at work?" "Nothing I couldn't handle. That's my girl. Strong as steel, soft as silk." After the call, she'd sat in the parking lot, engine off to save gas, and allowed herself 5 minutes to think about what had been lost. Not just the flying, though that was a wound that would never fully heal, but the purpose, the identity, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. She'd been part of a brotherhood that had reluctantly accepted a sister that pushed the boundaries of human capability. Now, she served beer to men who saw her as less than human. But then she'd thought about Marcus, the way his face lit up when she arrived at his program, the way he trusted her to make the chaos of the world make sense. She'd thought about her mother, fighting through another day of pain and exhaustion without complaint, drawing strength from Marianne's presence. They needed her in ways the Air Force never had. There was honor in that service too, even if it came with no ribbons or recognition. When she'd returned to the roadhouse, something had shifted. The atmosphere was different, charged with a new awareness. Customers looked at her not with dismissal but with curiosity, even respect. Sharon had offered to share tables during the lunch rush, unprecedented cooperation from someone who'd previously treated her like competition for tips. Eduardo had nodded from the kitchen, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge shared understanding they were both more than what this place had tried to make them. Near the end of her shift, Tom Bradley had approached again. "I need to tell you something," he'd said. "I run a small aviation museum about 20 miles from here. Nothing fancy, a few old birds, some memorabilia, educational programs for schools. The pay's not much, $22 an hour, but it includes benefits. Real benefits, not the garbage they offer here. We've been looking for someone who could talk to kids about modern aviation. Show them what's possible. Interested?" The offer had hit her like a physical blow. 22 an hour was fortune compared to 6 plus tips. Benefits meant her mother's medications might actually be covered. But more than that, it was a return to aviation. To the world she'd been forced to leave. "I'd need flexibility," she'd said carefully. "My mother has dialysis 3 times a week. My brother has special needs. Sometimes I have to leave suddenly. Whatever you need. Family comes first. The museum survived 40 years without you. It can handle flexible scheduling." That evening, she'd told her mother about the offer while helping her into bed, careful of the fistula site that looked like a snake under her skin. 22 an hour? Her mother had whispered, as if saying it louder might make it disappear. "And benefits? Baby, that's a miracle. It's working with aircraft again. Teaching kids about flying." Her mother had looked at her with eyes that saw everything despite the exhaustion. "You miss it. Flying. Every day." "I'm sorry, baby. So sorry you had to give it up for us." "I chose to, Mama. I'd choose it again." "That tattoo still there? The one you showed me when you earned it?" "Still there. Always will be. Good. Don't hide it anymore. You earned those wings. Whether you're flying or not, you earned them. 3 weeks later, Marianne had started at the museum. The building was a converted hangar with climate control that actually worked, and bathrooms that didn't require a tetanus shot to use safely. The aircraft collection was modest but meaningful. A P-51 Mustang that had flown over Germany, an F-86 Sabre from Korea, a Huey that Tom had actually flown in Vietnam, and various civilian aircraft that told the story of aviation's evolution. But it had been the educational program that truly mattered. School groups came through weekly. Kids from rural districts who'd never been on an airplane, who'd never thought about the sky as anything but a boundary. Marianne had developed a curriculum that combined hard science with inspiration, teaching them about lift and drag and thrust, while also showing them that someone who looked like them, black, female, from poverty, had flown the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. She'd set up a simple flight simulator using donated computers and open-source software. Most kids crashed immediately, overwhelmed by the three-dimensional thinking required. But some showed natural aptitude, an intuitive understanding of spatial relationships that couldn't be taught. These were often the quiet ones, the ones teachers had written off as slow or troubled, but who came alive when given controls and told they could fly. One afternoon, a group from Marcus's program had visited. He'd been so proud, telling everyone that his sister flew fighter jets, that she was the best pilot in the world. The other young adults, all with various developmental disabilities, had listened to Marianne explain flight with rapt attention. She'd let each of them try the simulator, adjusting the difficulty so everyone could experience success. When Marcus had successfully landed a virtual Cessna, the entire group had applauded, and he'd smiled so widely she'd thought her heart would break from love. 6 months into the museum job, Jennifer Chen had published her article. Not in some small regional paper, but in a major national magazine, The Fallen Eagle. How America Fails. Its heroes had told Marianne's story without sentimentality, focusing on the systemic failures that forced exceptional people to choose between service and family, between achievement and survival. The article had gone viral, a term Marianne hated but couldn't deny, described the overwhelming response. Letters had come from around the country. Young black girls who'd never considered aviation suddenly saw it as possible. Veterans who'd made similar sacrifices felt seen and validated. Fighter pilots, both active and retired, had reached out with respect and support. Someone had started a fundraiser for her mother's medical expenses that raised $30,000 in a week before Marianne had found out, and asked them to stop, uncomfortable with what felt like charity, despite the desperate need. Most surprisingly, Colonel Sarah Williams, now General Williams, had called personally. "I've been following your story," she'd said. "I was wrong to let you go. The Air Force failed you, forced an impossible choice. We're starting a new program, bringing veterans to speak at schools, especially in underserved communities. The pay is substantial. The schedule completely flexible. You'd be showing kids who look like you that the sky has no ceiling. Interested?" Marianne had looked at the tattoo on her shoulder. Faded but still clear. Still true. "I'll do it. But I stay based in Iowa. This is home now. Whatever you need. Welcome back to service. Captain Carter." The title had felt strange after years of "Hey, you and girl," but it also felt right, like reclaiming something that had always been hers. The roadhouse had continued without her, hiring another woman to be invisible and servile. Roy and his crew had found another place to drink their morning beer, where their worldviews went unchallenged. But the story of that morning, when assumptions had shattered like glass, had become local legend, told and retold, with embellishments that Marianne would have found amusing if she'd known about them. In the museum, surrounded by aircraft that represented dreams made metal, Marianne had found a different kind of flight. She couldn't pull 9Gs anymore, couldn't dance with death at twice the speed of sound. But she could lift others, show them that the sky wasn't a ceiling but a beginning, that gravity was negotiable if you had enough thrust and the right angle of attack. Every school visit, every wide-eyed child who touched the P-51's propeller with reverence, every teenager who suddenly understood that physics was the language of flight. These were her new missions. Less glamorous than flying the Raptor, but no less important. She was planting seeds that would bloom into pilots, engineers, dreamers who would push further and fly higher than she ever could. One day, a young black girl with thick glasses and clothes that marked her as poor had raised her hand during a presentation. "Did you really fly fighter jets?" "I did, but you're black, and a girl. I'm both. And I flew the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Why did you stop?" Marianne had thought about how to answer, how to explain sacrifice to someone so young. Sometimes, we choose between different kinds of flying. I flew F-22s in the sky. Now I help other people find their wings. Both matter. The girl had stared at the tattoo visible on Marianne's shoulder. "Will I have to choose too?" "Maybe. But whatever you choose it with your whole heart. And never let anyone tell you the sky isn't yours." Months had passed. The speaking engagements had provided enough income to move her mother to a better apartment, to get Marcus additional therapy, to replace the dying Honda with a reliable used Toyota. Not luxury, but stability. The first time in years, Marianne had gone to sleep without calculating whether they'd make it to the next paycheck. Her mother's health had stabilized, though the dialysis continued its slow extraction of life in exchange for time. Marcus had gotten a job at a local grocery store, stocking shelves with obsessive precision that delighted his managers. He still lived with them, might always need that support, but he was growing, becoming more himself every day. And Marianne had found an unexpected peace in her new life. She'd never fly the Raptor again, that door had closed forever. But she'd discovered that flight took many forms. Every child who left the museum looking up instead of down. Every young woman who suddenly saw aviation as possible. Every veteran who found renewed pride in their service. These were victories as real as any simulated kill in training. The tattoo remained on her shoulder, no longer hidden but displayed with quiet pride. It had become a teaching tool, a conversation starter, a bridge between what was and what could be. When she showed it to students, explaining what it meant to earn those wings, she saw their worldviews expand, their horizons lift. Sometimes, late at night, she'd dream of flying. Not the Raptor, surprisingly, but something without form or limit, pure motion through space that required no machine, no wings, except will. She'd wake from these dreams not with loss but with gratitude. She had flown. She had touched the edge of space, had danced with physics at the margin of possibility. That could never be taken away. The morning at the roadhouse, when Roy Brennan had grabbed her arm, when the tattoo had been revealed, when her past had erupted into the present that had been a pivot point, but not the one she'd expected. It hadn't been about vindication or revenge. It had been about remembering who she was beneath the uniform of survival, about recognizing that greatness takes many forms, that service doesn't always come with medals. She'd been magnificent in the sky. She was magnificent still on the ground. The tattoo proved the first. Her choices proved the second. Both were true. Both mattered. Both were exactly who Marianne Carter was meant to be. In the end, that August morning, when men had mocked a black woman for existing in their space, had become legendary, not because Marianne had proven them wrong, though she had, but because she'd proven something much more important. That dignity is not granted by others but carried within. That sacrifice for family is as noble as any military service. That sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing to stay grounded when you were born to fly, and finding ways to lift others instead. The F-22 tattoo that had frozen the morning crowd had become a symbol not just of what Marianne had achieved, but of what anyone could achieve given the chance. In a small museum in rural Iowa, surrounded by aircraft that would never fly again, but whose stories soared eternal, Captain Marianne Carter, call sign Valkyrie, continued her service. Different uniform, different mission, same dedication to something larger than herself. She had ruled the sky. Now she helped others find their wings. Both were forms of flight. Both were forms of freedom. Both were forms of love. And love, she'd learned, was the only force stronger than gravity.